All right, we are back for the second half of this section, and we are going to talk for the remainder of this section about juries. And juries are a very, very widely different system from country to country to country. There are some countries that use juries in every criminal case, and there's some countries that never have juries at all. And the way countries form juries and the tasks that they're asked to do are different radically from country to country to country, and it's a really interesting topic. But why do we have juries, right? Well, first off, we have to talk about protection against the state, right? We just ended the last part of the earlier section on authoritarian states. And we don't want authoritarian states taking away our life and liberty and pursuit of happiness without due process. And juries are thought to be one way that we can help prevent an authoritarian state from being an authoritarian state. We want juries and the criminal justice process to reflect community values, right? If the values of the criminal justice system and the values of the community become widely divergent, juries are there to be able to kind of make sure that those community values are able to kind of rein in the criminal justice system. One of the other goals is to learn about the criminal justice system itself, right? Every person who's ever served on a jury learned a lot about the criminal justice process through that jury participation. And as such, we can kind of create more knowledge about how the criminal justice system works among our populace if we have this jury system. One of the things that makes this entire process more difficult is social media, right? Because it is nigh on impossible to have a juror who doesn't have social media and ignores social media. So in other words, we get that influence of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and all those things will affect a juror's vision and objectivity of what their job is supposed to be and how they're supposed to do their job. We want jurors, especially in the adversarial systems, to really focus on what happens during the actual trial and focus on only the words and the evidence presented in court and the way it's presented in court. But with social media, it's becoming more and more commonplace for them to get an undue influence from outside the courtroom. Now, in England and Wales, they've had juries for at least 800 years, although at different points on that timeline, they've had more power and less power, and they've been more representative and less representative of the people of England and Wales. But they have had juries of some form for at least 800 years. Now, contrary to many inquisitorial systems, they're completely forbidden to talk about why they decided on guilty or not guilty. They're prevented from kind of discussing any of that. One of the kind of benefits of this process is the kind of the factor of jury nullification. This is where the jury can really do its best to reflect the community values by saying, no, we're not going to find that person guilty. Like, no matter what the evidence is, no matter what the law says, we as the jury believe this person should be found not guilty, either because we don't think what he did should be illegal, or we think it should have been justified, or any of those things. So the jury's able to say, nope, we found him not guilty. Even though you had mountains and mountains of evidence that he or she did it, we're still going to find him not guilty just because we don't think they should be punished for what they did. This is a relatively common thing with adversarial systems, and it will often be brought up in things like simple marijuana possession. In communities where marijuana possession is not seen as criminal, but they're still legally on the books laws against marijuana possession, many times juries will say, yep, he had a quarter pound of weed on him, but it was for personal use, we don't think that's wrong. So even though there's mountains of evidence that he's guilty, we're going to find him not guilty because our community does not want to punish people for what we see as a non-crime. In England and Wales, juries are only actually impaneled for 1 to 2% of all cases. That is remarkably small. But the vast majority of cases are dealt with through a plea bargain or some other kind of outcome rather than a jury trial. And in England and Wales, similar to the United States, jury decisions have to be unanimous in the vast majority of cases. But unique to England and Wales, the judge can, in certain very limited circumstances, instruct the jury, okay, you don't need to be unanimous for a guilty verdict. A 10 to 2 vote will suffice. Now, once again, I want to point out that the UK is not really one country. The UK is actually a collection of lots of little countries. But especially here in the United States, we tend to use words like England and the UK interchangeably when really they're vastly different. So one of the very small examples of how they're different, in Scotland, which is also part of the UK but separate from England, instead of 12 jurors, they have 15. On the Isle of Man, which is part of the UK but not part of England, they only have 7 jurors. So there's a vast difference in the criminal justice system, even on small things like the number of jurors in a trial, even within the UK, just like there's a vast difference in the United States from state to state to state. Now, in the United States, this is the system that I am most familiar with and can talk the most about. But the Sixth Amendment to our Constitution guarantees the right to trial by jury by anyone facing a loss of liberty, essentially. And for very, very, very minor crimes where the maximum punishment is, say, a fine, you don't have the right to a jury trial. But for anything where you're facing, a year in prison, you absolutely have the right to a jury trial. But according to federal law, you can kind of opt out. In other words, I don't want a jury trial. I want the judge to determine whether I'm guilty or not guilty. And this is relatively rare, but there are certain situations where the defendant or the defense counsel has determined, I think we stand a better chance if we let the judge decide than if we let some jury decide. And in that case, they will opt for a bench trial, and that is their right. If they don't want a jury trial, they don't have to have one. In the vast majority of time in the United States, juries are made up of 12 people, at least in the beginning. But there are some states, and in some cases, where you can have a smaller jury. I think it's Virginia, where you can have, for relatively minor offenses, you can have a jury as small as 6. But the Supreme Court has said you can require as little as 6. You cannot require more than 12. On the other hand, many juries, when they first start, have more than 12 people. It's relatively common for juries to begin with, say, 12 jurors and then 2 alternates for a total of 14. And in those cases, if one of the 12 jurors, say, gets sick or there's some emergency and they have to leave the case, one of the alternates can step in and they don't have to restart the trial. The alternates have been there kind of watching the trial along with the other jurors, but now they get to actually vote on the outcome. In other states, they just start with 12, and if somebody gets sick or leaves, it drops down to 11 or even 10 or whatever, and then they just have that many jurors now and don't try to bump it back up to 12. Until very recently, there were a few states where you could get a criminal conviction with less than a unanimous verdict, but just a couple years ago, I believe it was 2020, but it might have been 2019, don't quote me, the Supreme Court ruled that no, that's not allowed. Any guilty verdict has to be unanimous. If there's even one juror that says, I am absolutely refusing to vote for guilt, you cannot have a guilty verdict. So it is a requirement to have a unanimous verdict for a guilty defendant. Now, juries in the United States, usually, although it depends on the jurisdiction, you are selected based on voter rolls. So once you turn 18, you're registered to vote, and then any given court within the jurisdiction can get a list of all the voters in that jurisdiction and randomly select, however many people to come in for jury duty. The beginning of this process, they have a lot more than 12 for any given case. And at that point, both the prosecution and the defense can start eliminating people until they get down to 12 or 12 plus 2 alternates, or 6 if it's a very one of those very rare circumstances where they have a jury of 6. But you start with, say, 30. And then each side, the prosecution and the defense, can start eliminating people for cause, i.e., there is something with this individual that we think makes them incapable of being a objective juror, i.e., the defendant is this person's cousin. Thus, they're not an objective juror. We don't want them on the jury. This other person is a defense lawyer in his normal life. We don't want them on the jury. And then you can also eliminate for essentially no reason at all. Right? Each prosecution and defense lawyer gets some certain number of. You can eliminate them from the jury for no reason at all. Just, I don't like the look of their face. Juror number 5 and juror number 17 and juror number 8, we're going to eliminate them. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't eliminate people based on race, but at the same time, it's nearly impossible to prove because neither side has to say why they're eliminating someone. It's very difficult to prove that they were eliminated based on race. And this process of narrowing it down from 30 or 40 or 50 or however many down to 12 or 14 or 10 or however many, that process is called voir dire. And in the United States, we have a few more jury trials than England and Wales. It's roughly 3 to 10% of all cases, but that's still a very, very small number. But keep in mind, most people either plead guilty or it's a small trial that doesn't require a jury and things like that. Another kind of very weird system in the United States is in the states that have capital punishment, i.e. the death penalty, jurors are asked not just to determine guilt and innocence, but if the jury finds the defendant in a capital crime guilty, then the jury's job is not done. Now they have to sit and deliberate whether that person should get the death penalty or not. So they have essentially another phase of the trial. The adversarial system's back on. The defense tries to prove that the person doesn't deserve the death penalty. The prosecution tries to prove that the person does deserve the death penalty. And then the jury gets to decide whether that defendant that they have already found guilty deserves the death penalty or not. So it's kind of a weird double job in capital crime cases. Now, in inquisitorial cases, they often have a much more kind of close working relationship with the judge. They can sit there and discuss the dossier together. They can, deliberate with the judge, whereas in the United States, and I believe also in England and Wales, juries deliberate only by themselves. There's never anybody from outside the jury in the room when they're deliberating. In inquisitorial trials, often the jury and the judges deliberate together as a group. In Belgium, there's, for any given trial, there's 3 judges and 12 jurors. In Denmark, there are 3 judges and 12 jurors, similarly to Belgium, but instead of deliberating all together as a body of 15, they deliberate separately. The 3 judges deliberate, the jurors deliberate, and in order to get a guilty verdict, the 3 judges need to vote 2-1 for guilt, and the 12 jurors need to vote 8-4 for guilt. And then what's really interesting to me is in Germany, they have this process called lay judges. And these guys are not just a juror for one case. They're much more like a judge, and each case has a certain number of judges, professional judges and lay judges. But the lay judges don't just work one trial. It's like they sign up for like a 6-month stint as a lay judge, and then they work as many cases as kind of the country needs them to. and they do this process as a lay judge for multiple trials. And I think that's really, really, really interesting. In Spain, they have 9 jurors, and you need 7 to get a conviction. In Russia, following the fall of the Soviet Union, they reestablished the process of having jurors in 1993. 12, and Professor Jurgen wants to come in and say hi. Can you say hi, Jurgen? Can you say hi, Jurgen? Say hi to all the students out there. Yes, oh, you're a good boy. I really appreciate you coming to do a guest lecture for my class. We're talking about Russia. Do you want to tell the students anything about the jury? Oh, he likes juries, apparently. Well, in Russia, they have 12 jurors, and they need 7 to find guilt, which is a relatively low number comparatively. And interestingly, these jury decisions can be appealed, right? So if the state doesn't like the jury's decision of either guilt or innocence, those can always be appealed. In Japan, the number of judges and jurors is different depending on whether the person is essentially pleading guilty or not guilty. It's slightly different than guilty or not guilty, but close enough. So if you plead not guilty, you get 3 judges and 6 jurors. But if you plead guilty, you just get 1 judge and 3 jurors. Now, one of the other kind of weird and different situations is in South Korea. South Korea, up until relatively recently, had an authoritarian government, and they're just within the past few decades becoming more kind of democratic. And part of that is introducing a jury system, which was finally introduced in 2012, and now trials there have juries. But interestingly, the jury decisions are only advisory to the judge. So, in other words, if the jury can find the person not guilty, but if the judge says, I really think you made the wrong decision, the judge can kind of overrule the jury decision, and they only have to take it under advisement. They don't have to, the jury's decision is not final the way it is in the United States. Now, here's a list of countries that have no jury at all. And, this is not a complete list. This is just some of the larger, more kind of famous, more well-known countries that have no juries at all. They trust in judges to kind of determine whether someone's guilty or not guilty. They trust the system they have set up, and they believe they don't need any kind of citizen input and citizen oversight of this part of the criminal justice system. And, in many cases, it works. They don't, not all countries need that kind of oversight that juries provide. Ultimately, it kind of comes down to, who do you trust? Do you want professional judges determining whether somebody is guilty or innocent? Or do you want non-professional, regular citizens who aren't kind of subject to the same pressures that state actors are subject to? So it's, either way, there's a downside, right? So if you choose juries, you're getting non-professionals. Like, they don't know what they're doing. They're just normal people that don't really know about the law. Whereas if you choose to not have juries, you're kind of putting a lot of trust in the state apparatus, right? So each country has kind of decided for itself how it wants to do that. And in a lot of cases, one system works really well, and other cases, that system works terribly. So it's really just kind of up to every country or even every region how they want to accomplish those goals. All right, that's the end of that section. Thank you so much. I'll see you again soon for the next one. Jurgen, can you say goodbye? Can you say thank you, students? Please like and subscribe. Yo, go boy.